Japanese Garden Pruning, a PowerPoint presentation by Cass Turnbull of plantamnesty.org, which is an organization to promote better pruning. This is one of 12 presentations which are available either through plantamnesty.org or somewhere in the cloud. This is a Japanese garden. It's a formal Japanese garden, and it takes a great deal of pruning and a great deal of planning. And this slideshow will tell you how to do that pruning, or at least give you the beginning steps. A real Japanese garden expert would spend years doing just raking and weeding before he or she was even allowed to touch the shrubs with pruning. But seeing as how this is America, we're going to do a flash forward program. And here it is. There are only 3 types of cuts, and if people just knew the kinds of cuts and what was going to happen next, most of the malpruning in the world would end tomorrow. These cuts are the heading cut, which means to shorten a branch, either selective or non-selective, and the thinning cut, which removes a branch where it began as a bud. The heading cut, or the non-selective heading cut, you just whack a branch back to no place in particular, and it creates the upsurge of a lot of water sprouts at the ends of each branch. A non-selective heading is the cause of most malpruning, but there are exceptions, and one of them is in Japanese garden pruning. We'll go over that soon. The selective heading cut is better for the health of plants and lasts longer. It is the correct way to shorten the length of a branch by cutting to a side branch which is big enough. If you don't do too many selective heading cuts, also called reduction cuts, and they're not too big, you won't get the water sprout rebound effect. The third kind of a cut is called a thinning cut, or now it's called a removal cut. And this takes off the smaller of the 2 forks back to where it began as a bud. This is the best for the health of a plant. Notice that it never made anything smaller. This would be like limbing up a tree or thinning out a camellia to make it more lacy and see-through. I've divided plants into 3 categories as to how they are most often pruned. The first category is Mounding-Habit Shrubs. These are plants that have small leaves. They're basically, wider than they are tall, and they are the blobs of the plant world. They are the chorus line, and you will see them in mass plantings in most landscapes. This is how we most often prune Mounding-Habit Shrubs. You locate the branch which sticks up the most and bugs you the most, and follow it down inside the plant to a side branch or to the ground and cut it off there, tossing it out to the lawn. Then you locate the next worst branch that bugs you, sticks up, or hits the house, and you follow it down to a side branch, a bud, or to the ground, snip it off, and toss it out to the lawn. This is called the grab and snip technique, and you can make a Mounding-Habit shrub, I would say about a quarter smaller, and take off about a third of the foliage without getting into trouble. And by trouble, I mean water sprouts. Basically, you grab and snip until you sense you're running out of green, then you stop. This is an example of Mounding-Habit shrubs, which are the lower story in a Japanese garden. They are evergreen azaleas, and they have been pruned selectively using the grab and snip technique. And that's fine, and it looks good, and we're all happy. This is Chapter 1. It's about Tamamono, shearing, and bamboo. Appropriate shearing is sometimes used in Japanese gardens. It's also used with hedges and real topiary, and also is the Tamamono, sheared shrubs in Japanese gardens. In general, we stay away from shearing because it's not good pruning. But when we are talking about Japanese formal gardens, we get into the realm of what's called pruning art, which breaks the rules of pruning to achieve a special effect. But please note, this is extraordinarily high maintenance, and you don't want to do this to just any landscape. You only want to do it when you are working in a real, bona fide Japanese garden. Tamamono shearing of lower story plants. This is an example of when shearing is used correctly. The lower story Mounding-Habit shrubs are sometimes sheared into a dome shape. You don't want to make muffins. That's wrong no matter what landscape you're working in. You want more of a dome, and a flatter dome is better. Along with this dome, you also want to cut a narrow slot between the ground and the shrub. It's like putting a black frame around a picture. It makes it show up better. This slot, which you do with your head shears, as you do the entire plant, is only maybe a quarter to a half inch off of the ground. You also want to create that little bit of space between your Tamamono and any other rocks or hardscape that might exist. You do use a head shears to create this Tamamono shrubbery, and the Japanese will actually use a special kind of head shears with a very long handle, which is better balanced for this sort of work. And they sometimes even use that head shears upside down to do the backside or the shoulders of the shrub. Here's an example of Tamamono shearing in a Japanese landscape. Sometimes your Tamamono joins together and creates what's called okarakomi, which is a wave of sheared shrubs. This is an example how you might take Tamamono and turn it into the wave, which is a very lovely effect used on the lower story of Japanese gardens. Entokai means tall dome, and that is actually when we use taller shrubs and shear them into sort of a cylinder with a dome on top in the very far reaches of the landscape. I don't like it, so I'm not including any pictures here. Cane growers are the second category of shrubbery that is found in all landscapes. These are plants that renew themselves with branches that we call canes that arise directly from the ground. And these branches do not divide many times. They sort of remind you of, say, a feather, a main stem with little side bits. Examples would be forsythia, nandina, Oregon grape, and frequently in Japanese gardens, bamboo. This is how we most frequently pruned cane-growing shrubs. We saw out canes, which are branches that arise from the ground, canes, to the ground or to a couple inches above. If you take out, say, a third or an eighth of the canes every year, you're renewing your shrub and keeping it short, and you're also opening it up and making it more delicate. One of the most frequent cane-growing shrubs in the Japanese garden is bamboo. Bamboo, one of the most beautiful and dangerous plants in the world. Bamboo is famous for invading landscapes, coming up through floorboards, traveling down the inside of hoses in the garden, and generally destroying people's lives. But it's also truly beautiful. There's nothing more beautiful than backlit bamboo. It adds an important vertical element into landscapes. It can be thinned out to be more beautiful. There exists both clumping and spreading bamboos, although clumpers sometimes run and runners sometimes clump. You have to be very careful where you put your bamboo. I know some people who have planted it in the pots in the ground to keep it from running. Sasa bamboo, which is a really short bamboo, is known to run and destroy people's lives, as are some of the spreading bamboos. So be very, very careful where you put it. I'm not saying I don't like bamboo. I'm saying it's kind of like lion taming to have it in your landscape. This is a stand of bamboo, and notice that you can see that vertical element very clearly, and that the vertical element is very observable at the bottom of the clump. With bamboo, you want to thin it out by cutting canes right to the ground, not an inch or two above, but very carefully sawing it off, sometimes with a keyhole saw, right down to the ground. That way you won't get those ugly stubs. You also want to rake out or blow out all those leaves. And to make your bamboo clump look better, you want to take off the little side branchlets at the base, say up 1 or 2 feet. And then the next 2 to 4 feet, you take off, sort of every other one. And then as you get to the taller parts, you leave them completely foliated. This will make things look better. You just have to trust me. You can take off, 50% of the canes to the ground to make it airy and delicate, and certainly all the ones closest to the house. And you probably want to go in and snap out a fair number of the culms as they arise in the spring to keep the number reduced. Other things to know about your bamboo. It tends to flop out in snowstorms or in heavy rains, which is unattractive. A couple things that you can do to prevent that. You can use clear fishing line to tie back your bamboo. Bamboo is really a grass. It's not a regular dicotyledon. And that means that the girth does not increase, and you can tie something around it and never worry about girdling it. Isn't that interesting? Something I like to do is to make sort of a handrail around the outside of the bamboo clump. I use the naturally occurring bamboo by cutting it off to, say, 4 feet, and then use cross pieces to tie on. I use zip tie, but if you're a true Japanese garden, you might want to use some very attractive black line and tie it together. And that way, when the snow hits, the bamboo canes cannot go flopping out onto your lawn or walkway. What else about bamboo? And you don't want to ever whack it off midway because it will not resprout at that level. It'll just be an ugly headed off stick. That's it for bamboo and Tamamono shearing. Chapter 2 is Japanese maples. The third category of shrubs and trees is the tree-like shrubs. These are the Cadillacs of the plant world. They have an articulate, woody branch structure that divides many times, and you do not want to mess it up with selective and non-selective heading cuts. It has a much smaller pruning budget. The Mounding-Habit and the cane grower shrubs, you can take out about 1/3 of the foliage and reduce the height by about 1/4 before you get into trouble. But when you get onto the tree-like shrubs, you want to pull way back with both the amount and the kind of pruning. Here are the general rules for pruning trees and tree-like shrubs. This is an illustration of some of the cuts you might make. At the base, you'll see straight-up shoots, which are the true suckers, not water sprouts, coming up from the trunk or the base of a tree or shrub, and they need to be removed, and they need to be removed every year. There's no magic cure for suckers. Also, you want to take off the branch that's actually touching the ground. We almost always start at the base of plants and limb them up if only 1/2 inch or up to, say, 1 foot, depending upon how tall they are. Working our way up through this plant, you'll notice on the right that there are 2 parallel branches, and you might want to take out one of those, usually the bottom one. If you have 3 parallel branches, you take out the middle one. This just makes things look more open and airy. You could randomly thin out some branches in your tree-like shrub, and it would look better to you. But gardeners have found out which ones have the most aesthetic bang per buck. Thinning out of a tree or a tree-like shrub just makes it open and airy, crisp and clean, and nice. Back on the other side, you'll notice there's a branch that starts on the outside, crosses through the trunk, and out the other side. That's Mr. Wrongway. He's inside almost every tree or shrub, and you need to locate him and cut him off as long as to do so does not exceed the pruning budget for your plant. Back on the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of branches, one that goes too far up and one that goes too far down into the layer. Trees and shrubs arrange themselves in layers, and if one branch crosses way far up into the area above, it might look better to take it off. Back on the left-hand side, you can see a crossing rubbing branch. It often looks better to take out a few of the worst, certainly not all, of the crossing rubbing branches. At the very top, you can see some modest size reduction, which only works on some of the shrubs and not many of the trees, although I should tell you that in authentic Japanese gardens, there is a lot of size constraint which would be considered insane in the average American landscape. But let's not dwell on that. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of inappropriately sheared camellias. It just doesn't look good.